Welcome to the SmartGrid educational series for February 2014. I am Irfan Ibrahim, your moderator, and I would like to thank our hosts here at TUV Rhineland, especially Gary Sorkin and Matthias Heinz in Pleasanton, California, who have brought some amazing sandwiches and brownies that I'm thinking people are actually going to take home today because they're so moist. And for those of you remotely, I'm going to rub it in a little more that you could not come here in person. But I see a lot of smiley faces after having had these brownies. I would like to welcome you to this very important presentation. From time to time, I ask utilities to come on the SmartGrid educational series and tell us a little bit about reality. I get lots of vendors presenting their wares, and they talk about their way of looking at things, and there's a valid place for that. I get trade associations telling us about what they're doing. I get individual subject matter experts coming and talking about things that they're passionate about. But I really like it when a utility comes and presents, because what a utility is facing today is the pressure from public utility commissions or from their city government or from their co-ops boards to provide electricity cheaply, efficiently, cleanly, safely, and all of those non-functional adjectives. But the challenge is, how do you do that while the fuel costs keep rising? You're doing away with nuclear power plants and coal-fired plants, and the demand for electricity is not growing in a very predictable way. Plus, there are all these events that occur, natural disasters occurring, other types of emergencies occur, that render a lot of electricity unavailable to consumers. And so consumers are looking for more choices. So it's like a operations research problem where more and more constraint lines are being put on the utilities, and the region of interest where you can actually operate is getting smaller and smaller. So the only way out of that, in my opinion, is innovation. And by innovation, I don't mean just throwing a lot of technology at a problem. I'm talking about getting people in the utility community to sit and talk about their problems, define the problem to the point where there's a process by which the problem can be solved, and that there's consensus within the utility that this is the process to go. And I have to say that I have access to lots of utilities in North America. I know many people personally, and I have to say that PG&E is one of those unsung heroes. And the reason why I call them an unsung hero is they didn't get the stimulus-funded projects, you know, the check that allowed them to just deploy SmartGrid. So whatever they had to do had to reflect on their bottom line, on their balance sheet. They had to explain to the Public Utility Commission why they were looking for increases in the rate, how would they justify that investment. So while the revolution for SmartGrid was there and the demand on all the utilities was there to deploy, PG&E had to find money in their own treasury to pay for this. And so there's good news and bad news in that. The good news is that it forced them to be more innovative, more creative, and it took them a while to figure out what kinds of things to deploy that made sense, that gave them a positive benefit to cost ratio of like greater than 1. And you see that deep thinking and reflection in the way they're deploying technologies today in the service territory. So consumers may be impatient and say, well, I didn't get this service or that service, but there's a very methodical process. And Art Anderson from PG&E is one of those thought leaders that sits back and reflects. And we're both from the same school, so I know where this training comes from. Not to get too impressed by hype. That's one thing you learn at Cal Berkeley, is that you have to sit back and reflect on things before you render a decision. And this scientific process, and I call this the scientific process that PG&E has implemented, is allowing them to deploy smart grid technologies in a very methodical way, in a way where the frequency of awkward U-turns is kept to a minimum. I'm not saying zero, but kept to a minimum. So here is a topic of VoltVAR optimization, which is the purpose of the presentation today. You've heard about voltage fluctuations on the line. There are many reasons for that. You can have a whole bunch of people come online on the grid, and that can lower the voltage. You can have surges and drops, especially if there's renewable energy that is on the grid. And there are a variety of things that can occur at a system level that can cause the voltage to fluctuate. So you need some mechanism to regulate the voltage, because if the voltage goes above or beyond the 5% bar around the 240 volts, let's say, to a customer, many systems can trip. And that's bad, because then you have to do a lot of resetting. This is not as big a problem in residential sector as it is in commercial and industrial sector. So it's very important to regulate the voltage. Also, we lose about 5% of our energy in the distribution network, about 2% in transmission, about 5%. And the 5%, I would say only about 1 or 1.25% can be attributed to Ohm's law. In other words, due to resistive losses. The rest of it is a result of mismatch. And when I say mismatch, I'm talking about where the power factor deviates from unity. And the reason why the power factor deviates from unity is because there are inductive loads that are not being properly corrected for by turning on the appropriate capacitor banks. And the reason why that happens is because capacitor banks switching gear needs to be monitored, and a lot of it is not monitored. So if it malfunctions, you don't even know. So there are a lot of things that happen in a distribution network that lead to less than optimal modes of operation. And VoltVAR optimization as an application with the appropriate sensors and the switching gear is an attempt to reduce those losses, make it more efficient, and also keep the voltage within the acceptable band. So this is the area, it's a high priority area for a distribution company like PG&E to deploy, because imagine how many additional power plants you can avoid building if you could reduce these losses of the 5% down to, let's say, 4% or 3%. And all you have to do is go to Korea or Taiwan or Japan, and you see that the overall loss in T&D in places like Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, when I visited, was around 3.9% as opposed to our 7%. And no smart grid deployed yet. It's just constantly feedback loop. You know, as the engineers go out in the field, they see suboptimal behavior, and they keep recommending changes, small configurational changes that keeps the number as low as 3.9%. We are trying to get there through smart grid applications where sensors are put, they bring the data back, we process the data, and then we turn it into actionable intelligence. So the appropriate capacitor banks can be brought on or taken off, and the voltage can be regulated, and so can the VAR support be given. We're also counting on customers to provide storage as a way of doing frequency regulation, for instance. We see that in transmission companies. We can now go towards these same customers for ancillary services in the future to keep the grid as efficient as possible and avoid building new power plants if we can. So with that backdrop, I'd like to welcome Art Anderson, who is the manager of the Smart Grid Lab here in San Ramon, California, who has some experience to share with you on VoltVAR. And this is the reality that I was talking about that impresses me when I bring utilities. So with that, Art, we're going to switch chairs here so that you can be close to the speaker, and welcome, Art.
Thank you. Thanks, Irfan. I really appreciate bringing me out here and giving me this opportunity. As Irfan said, I manage the SmartGrid lab at PG&E, and this is just a part of the area that's involved with this particular technology and this particular effort. So what I'm going to talk about is the pilots that we are doing at PG&E and what does it take to do this sort of analysis. What does it take to really look at a new solution in the utility environment? And this is from a utility. This is from the perspective that I need to roll this out, put this in my territory, and support it. So the first thing we've got to consider is we have 70,000 square miles. This isn't one circuit. This is over 170 circuits. So optimization is a wonderful thing, and a percent may not make much of a difference on one circuit, but on over 170, the effect can be quite significant. So anything we have to consider, anything we are talking about in this regard, we need to understand how will this play out over our whole territory. And the territory is coastal area, mountains, hot areas, cold areas, and hard to reach areas, and long distances. So anything we talk about, we have to understand in the context of the customers that we're serving. So as Irfan mentioned, we proposed to do 3 pilots, and we're approved by the CPUC. So what this takes is we propose that we want to do something, and then we investigate how would we do that? How is it practical? What would this return be? And how much would it cost? And we work with the CPUC, who looks at our proposal and gives us feedback, and then we come to an agreement. Okay, these are the projects we want to do over this time frame, for this amount of money. And as we learned with some of our other deployments, you really need to have things together and figure it out, because there isn't a do-over. There's no okay, will you give you another time frame or another bit of money? You really need to make it work and do what you've agreed to do in the time that you've agreed to do it for the money that you have. And technology doesn't always come wrapped with a pretty bow that allows you to just turn it on. So what we're going to do with these pilots and the way we are approaching this is, since we have a large territory and safety and reliability is our paramount concern, what we're doing is there's enough uncertainty in this technology, we are starting with a lab pilot. Nothing goes in the field until we've looked at it in the lab. And then next year, we're going to start, once we go, and we're starting with a larger group of vendors and narrowing it down, according to which solutions are better, which meet our needs more, which are the more desirable solutions, which work with our equipment. So 2015, we'll do somewhat of a limited field pilot and see how do things work in the real world. Then we'll learn from that, like we learned from the lab pilots. And then we'll look in 2016, a more integrated solution. How does this work in an integrated fashion that we might use to deploy? Then we have a general rate case in 2017. Then we'll be able to say, okay, this is what we know is appropriate for our territory. So it's not a fast process, but we want to make it an effective one. So I'm going to focus on VoltVAR today. So in case anybody isn't aware, first off, managing voltage. There's nothing we can turn off. We're on 24/7, and we're regulated to provide a specific level of service. Nothing can interfere with that. So anytime we make a change, like with any system, we've got to keep it running. We've got to keep it running in the appropriate fashion according to the spec that we're given. So that's another consideration. VoltVAR is a wonderful thing, but it can't detract from what we provide today and what we'll provide in the future. So looking at VoltVAR, it's really the goal is improving efficiency through optimization and establishing conservation voltage reduction, the ability to do that. And also having much more visibility and much this involves more visibility, more closely managed circuits, more automation. This will help with reliability and early voltage issue detection. So for PG&E, you look at our territory, there are many ways to get voltage. There are many ways to manage a circuit. So we don't want to miss something that we should look at. So we have over 5 million electric smart meters. We've got the bandwidth and they can give us voltage. So we've got to decide in part of the lab and field pilots, is this the right place to get voltage? Is this the right place to monitor and get that information? And if we want to do that, how many reads do we need? Does it need to be, we get hourly reads for residential, 15-minute reads for commercial. Do we need 15-minute voltage reads for all meters? Do we need more frequent than that? We need to discover this. And then when we give that information to our VVO engine, how often should we expect those adjustments? What's the appropriate time frame to make adjustments for voltage on a circuit, and what parts? Then another alternative is we have a large sensor network. Should this information come from the substation? Should this come from the grid equipment? And then we also look, can that network support this effort? What demands are we going to place on that network? Because these are things, when you have a territory the size of PG&E, the vendor's not really going to be able to tell you. They'll give you estimates. But what we need to do is figure out how do we know? Because we really can't roll anything out until we have more information and enough information. Then, as we roll something like this out, what about our other systems? You know, how does this affect our SCADA system? Do we need upgrades? And then every circuit's going to be different. Every circuit's going to have different number of cat banks, tap changers. You know, it's voltage regulated. They all look different. So we also need to identify which circuits should we start with, which circuits shouldn't we do, and then how do we adapt this solution for each of them, because they're all going to be different. So this is I work in San Ramon for PG&E, and we have a test facility there. And this, at a very basic level, shows the capability of how we're setting this up in the lab and the capability that we've got. We have a distribution test yard where we have lines, we have cat bank controllers, we have regulators, we have the field equipment and a SCADA system. Then we have built a test environment to test each VVO engine. We have a DMS system, and then we have a model. Along with that, the lab that I manage, we have a test AMI system. So then we've built a meter farm of physical meters, and then we also have a meter simulator where we can simulate the meters we need to build each circuit that we want to simulate and test, because we need real input from this real system at a circuit level in the lab environment. So this is the environment in which we're going to do this and how it will all work together. So this is the distribution test yard. This is actually what it looks like. There's a SCADA system, and this shows what the yard, how the yard appears. So this is all in the same facility. And so these are real pieces of equipment that we've brought in so that we understand if a VoltVAR solution is making changes on a particular piece of equipment, how does SCADA report that? And how can it talk to this equipment? Because they'll all do it differently. Or some will talk to SCADA, and SCADA will talk to the equipment. So these are the things we need to actually see in action. Because I don't want to trust anyone that says we'll be fine with this piece of equipment. We want to actually see it, so we've built the hardware and we've figured out how to make these things connect, and we actually need to see what happens and how things are working. We also have a distribution technology operations center. We are consolidating 13 operations centers down to 2 major centers, and every centralized system, we now have a test environment where we look at it in this setting to understand what are our operators going to see. If we give them a new piece of technology, how does this relate with what they look at every day? Because we don't want to give them something they can't manage. And we don't want to give them too many things because then they're not going to manage things safely. So we want to make sure that everything we run, everything we test, everything we ask anybody to manage, that they really can do it, and that it works for them, and that they can do it safely. So this is the center we use for that. So then I will go on. We also have the lab that I manage. This is the Smart Meter lab. And we have, as I mentioned, it's completely off production. It's completely lab. And it's an AMI head-end system. We have built a meter farm. We've done home area networking testing there. We do meter testing, firmware changes, software changes, any upgrades. We also do communication device testing. Transmission power, receive sensitivity, we get down to the physical layer. So this is where we are building, we have the capability to use meter and AMI data for input into a VVO engine, and then in a bit I'll show you how we're building what we need, what we need to build to be able to make this capability relevant for these pilots. So back to the testing process. So when you start a testing process, you've got to have requirements. And so for us to look at a solution like this and start in a lab, we've got to understand, can it work within what we've got? Because there's not, this is a specific implementation. We're talking about VoltVAR. This doesn't mean we can change SCADA. This doesn't mean we can change equipment. This doesn't mean we can change our AMI solution. So a big part of what we're looking at is, how does this flow across PG&E databases and systems? And then if there are gaps, we need to figure them out now, because that's the last thing you want to understand if you're going to the field is, oh, we don't have this piece. And this can take development. This can take vendor solutions. The lab is the place to identify what we're up against. We also want to demonstrate the flow of how do we control devices. As I mentioned, that's in our distribution test yard. How does each solution work? And then end to end, how is it going to flow and ultimately be automated so that it's usable in our environment and in the field? Then we've got to understand, what do these things do? How is the logic of each of them designed, and how do they work? So we are working with requirements and writing test cases, test scripts to exercise this logic and to confirm so that we can compare, because all of these things are different. So we've got to understand, how does each one work, and then build the ability to compare. How is one logic different from another, and what are they going to do? And then we have to understand, how do we account for measurement errors? How do we account for model errors? And so part of that is to simulate devices and then provide actual devices and test the equipment. Now, from a benefits perspective, that's going to be an ongoing through the several phases of the pilot, because it'll be too challenging in the lab with as much simulated to identify real benefits of a circuit. We'll model it, and we'll understand integration, and we'll understand logic. Benefits will come more in the field stages, as we'll be able to compare benefits. We'll get an idea at first, but then as we go to the field, the benefits will become clear. So we're looking in the process of an RFI, so I'm not going to talk about vendors or selections or anything like that, but I will talk about, they're all different. Some use AMI data, some don't. Some are heuristic, some use field equipment, some use a model. Some use a combination. Some solutions are localized. They're not centrally managed. Some use distributed intelligence. Some control equipment in different ways. Actual tap change versus set points. They operate differently. Some use SCADA, some don't. And then some are implemented along with the DMS system. So they're all over the map. So comparison becomes a challenge when you've got different architecture and different approaches, different data sources, everything's going to look different. Ultimately, you're changing voltage on a circuit, or not, or modifying or making adjustments. So ultimately, the result is the same, but what we're doing is figuring out how do we implement all this in the lab, how do we implement each one, and then how do we evaluate it? How do we know which is preferable and what decisions are going to be made by these solutions? So, big question, well, who's done this before? We don't want to ignore that question. So we have a business team, and, as I sort of probably brought up in this project, we have smart meter business, distribution operations is involved, information technology is involved. We're formed into business technology groups that support each line of business. Several units of business are involved in this effort because it's complex. A lot of areas of the utility are affected by a solution that manages voltage on our circuits. So we have a business team, and they've been looking at talking to other utilities, talking to vendors, talking to Gartner, talking to EPRI about how fast are we innovating in this space. Because we need to look at a solution now, but we need to look at a solution over the next 5, 10, 20 years because we don't want to pick something that's end of life. Or we don't want to pick something that works with our solution, the rest of our infrastructure now, and not next year when we've made a change or upgraded it. So looking to the marketplace is really useful for us, and we're looking at who's implemented this, what did they find, and what kind of limitations. We're talking to different test labs, different utilities. How hard was this for you? What did you do about your model? What did you do about an unbalanced circuit? Something like that. We're asking these questions, and then measurement and verification. How have you guys approached this? So we're asking all these questions of the industry so we can get a better understanding of what are the pitfalls and what do we need to be aware of and how should we approach this. Because we're doing the best we can, but we're very clear we don't know everything. We know what we know, and it's really useful to get other people's experience and actual, what do you have in the field? What have you deployed and what have you found? Along this investigation process, we've kind of identified nobody's really done it to our scale. If we're going to, PG&E, this is not an unusual thing to encounter with PG&E. Few utilities have the size and the varied territory and the numbers that we do. So this information is great information for us, but we also have to understand, okay, this is great to know, but how is this going to work for us? Because scale often changes everything. So I'm going to use an AMI solution as an example just because that's kind of the most complicated one. What we're doing in the metering lab is we are using our physical meter farm, so we're getting reads from those meters. Then we're using a meter simulator to ramp up to 1 or 2 circuits, so we can ramp up to 3,000 or 6,000 meters. And then we're handing off that data to a VVO solution. Different solutions take data in different formats. Sometimes they're on different networks. So we've got to figure out, we're building the capability. Because, a meter simulator is used to, in our experience, usually used for scale testing. So to actually make them addressable by voltage is an interesting challenge. And with our meter farm, we're great reading meters. Now we're setting voltage. That's something different. That's something we're building here. The distribution test yard, they've got the capability for this equipment. Now they're actually mounting specific equipment for this testing to reflect what these circuits look like and what they need to talk to. And then they've got to use the VVO solutions, like how do we communicate with these pieces of equipment. Everything also has to be validated with our model. So we have software that maintains a model, and we have to understand. So we've made some changes. What does that do to the model? You know, how do we evaluate that? Because everything's got to be by our model, our DMS system. So that's sort of the left edge, upper corner is the validation area. And part of this process, what we're learning is, in the lab, how does it flow, how does it integrate, and then how do we evaluate it? Because we've got to know that before we get anywhere near the field. So this is just sort of reiterate what I've been saying. It's got to fit within our ecosystem. It's got to match what we're doing going forward. And then we need to be able to figure out which system makes the best choices. And how does these choices, the type of choices it makes, relate to our territory? Because, you know, another utility in a different climate, in a different situation might make different choices. So our environment is really important and critical to understand and evaluate how the logic executes. And then part of this is, vendors are going to be installing software. We're going to be finding issues. We're going to be running into surprising things that are much better than we thought and some not so fun things. So how a vendor jumps on that, how a vendor helps us, and how knowledgeable they are with their own solution, how they integrate their solution is critical. How soon do they call you back? These are big factors. And then anything on the roadmap, that's reasonable, but roadmap is not now. So roadmap is valid, but a criteria for vendor comparison is how much functionality is on their roadmap and how much is real. So it's kind of what I've been saying. Another factor is, you know, with a VVO solution, each vendor has a different idea of when we should run this and when we don't, when we shouldn't. And then the utility has specific guidelines on if there's an outage, you're not doing this. And then we have other factors like upgrades. And then there's a storm. Probably not the best time to reduce voltage. We've got to understand all these business processes as well. And vendors will tell us some things, and then we know some things. But this solution is a combination of our own experience and what the vendor is going to tell us. So part of what we'll want to exercise in the lab is, when do these things, how do they shut off? When do we not run them, and how do we execute that? Because it's going to be critical. And, you know, as I mentioned, some products have a great design, and they sometimes, when you turn them on, they don't do everything they say. And we need to know this. Another solution, sometimes they're great, but they're not interoperable. Oh, yeah, you don't have our recloser. Well, we don't talk to that one. We've got to know that. And so part of that's really why we're starting in the lab, is we've got to know these things before. You know, it would be great, just turn it on in the field, turn it on in our territory, but there's too many things to be aware of, and too many risks with not starting in the lab. As far as input, you know, garbage in, garbage out. What if our model's bad? What do you do? So each solution that is model-based has got to have has a different answer for that, and they've got to have a good answer, because this is the real world, and our model may not be perfect, and so we've got to figure out, what do we do if it's not? And then, you know, with AMI data, it's good data and it's real, but what if, you know, what if that circuit is being affected by something in particular? We've got to understand, how do we validate every piece of data? And then, you know, it's the same with heuristic. If we're getting data from the field, we've got to understand, how do we validate the data? How do we know the adjustments are valid? So part of that is our discovery process with lab testing and then field testing. And once again, roadmap. If something is really great and we really want it, and we choose a vendor, what if they don't deliver? Anything that is not here now, not a bad thing, but it's a risk. What if that developer quits? What if somebody buys that vendor? You know, things change. So we've always got to keep this kind of these kind of concerns have to be at the top of our consideration whenever we do anything like this. Then this slide I just put into to show, since it's an RFI and since we're in the process of selecting vendors and we're in the process of building this, I really can't give you our more sophisticated project documents. So this is kind of a really simple piece of illustration just to show you. Like the arrows show kind of what we're building. You know, we have a model. We've got to be able to take that model and say, how do we tell a meter to do that? So what we've done is I've had engineers build actual boards. Our meter farm has modules of 5 meters, and he's built a board where we can plug that into the 5-meter box and vary the voltage specifically of every meter. So on our meter farm, we figured out how do we set voltage individually on all the meters differently, if we choose to do that. And then we have this meter simulator. We've actually figured out how to use scripting tools to add voltage to it, because it didn't come that way. Then once we simulate that voltage, we can read it out of the head-end system, because that's not changing. That will read voltage. It's just we've got to figure out in the lab, how do we set all these things? And then what do we set them to, which will be guided by the model. Now, if we don't have an AMI solution, the whole left portion of that diagram disappears. And then, well, actually, we'll use the AMI as a validation. Implementing the VVO test, the VVO test environment with one that doesn't depend on AMI, we won't have the input, but we'll still use AMI to validate the values. But then, you know, a model-based solution, we'll use our modeling software, SIME, and then we'll figure how do we apply the model? How do we create the model that's valid for these test cases? And then apply that to that VVO engine. And then as heuristic, we'll use the distribution test yard and get the values from SCADA, and we'll get the values from the field. We apply it to the VVO engine, find the changes, and then see how does that affect the model? What does that look like with the meters? So these are the this is the type of work that we're involved in this year, right in the middle of now, to be able to test and compare these solutions. So this is specific to a utility, but it's something everybody needs to be aware of. This is one of those projects that's really complex and involves a lot of different groups that may not have worked together before. So as I call this is a growth opportunity for us. Distribution operations may not be that familiar with smart meter operations, may not have worked with transmission before. We're all working together. We're all sharing requirements. We're all creating different parts of the same test harness, and we will run the same test scenarios. So information technology is working with operations. Smart meter operations is working with grid operations. Many different groups are coming together. So it's a stretch for the utility, and it's a tremendous opportunity. It's sort of what every part of this industry is going to run into with the smart grid. Because smart means intelligence, it means communication, it means better management, it means better efficiency, and it implies integration. So it means systems work together, and that means people have to work together, and different groups have to work together. So it's not always something that's historically happened, but it's happening now. Now, then there's, the big bad R&D. These systems don't talk to each other out of the box. Or sometimes they don't. Or they may have, okay, we talk DNP3, you talk DNP3. But then we've got to understand, well, wait a minute, our SCADA system doesn't support those commands. Or we use this particular scenario, but why doesn't your solution execute that? There's usually filling in the gaps requires development and some research. What's the best way to do it? How do we code it? How do we maintain that? Integration is huge because we can't replace other parts of the system. So development's always a factor, and we'd rather use technology, the technology expertise that's available in the industry. We don't want to build and code everything, certainly not. But different solutions operate in different ways. So everything's going to take research and development. And so this is the smart grid is a huge cultural shift for an industry like the utilities. So in any aspect, in any project like this, that brings everything together and is this complex, always keep this in mind. So for us, it's fantastic. It's really a great opportunity for information sharing. But we do need to acknowledge it's different. Then the major thing is this. We had a good year regarding reliability last year, and we did well. And our smart meter network's operating quite well. We're getting excellent accuracy numbers, better than the system it replaced. Anytime we make changes, and I probably sound like a broken record, but anytime we make changes, we can't change this. Like there's really no opportunity to say, oh, we dropped our reliability by this much percent or more, or smart meter, this doesn't work or that doesn't work. Not a possibility. So that's why 4 years to get to a rate case might seem like an eternity, but this is what we've got. It's sort of like trying to paint your car when you're driving down I-5 at 70 miles an hour. It's not easy, but we can't turn the systems off. We can't turn the lights off. It's up 24/7, and it has to be reliable 24/7, and we need to read the meters 24/7. So these are big changes, and they could affect all of our circuits, and most likely won't. We'll do this in a targeted manner to the circuit zone, which is most appropriate. But at any time we do anything, this is what we've really got to keep in mind. So that's, I begin with the size and scale of PG&E and end with this has got to be our goal 100% of the time. And that's really all I have today.
Wonderful. Let's switch chairs again. As you can see, Art lived up to my expectation of following the scientific method. And this is part of the smart grid community, just has not gotten it yet. That just because we are on this bandwagon of smart grid doesn't mean that the scientific method is put to rest. So what you do is you start out with some intuition, you create a hypothesis, then you design an experiment to validate your hypothesis. And when you have validated it, then you go and implement it. But if your results of your test turns out to be different than your original hypothesis, you have to modify your hypothesis. You cannot hold on to the original hypothesis. And a lot of what I see in smart grid starts out with a very strong hypothesis, but if the test results are coming out different than the hypothesis, there is some creative language that is used to explain the deviation, and that ultimately doesn't serve the customer. So I'm really glad, Art, that you're taking these 3-4 years and doing the scientific method on this, because when you will go to commercial deployment, you will not have those awkward moments when circuits are turning on and off like Motel 6 lights at night. That's not something you want to do. And
the lab is the place where things can break.
Wonderful. And you have a very nice progressive approach where it affects more and more people until it will affect everyone. But by the time it affects everyone, the confidence level is very high that it will work.
Absolutely.
So it's not like you just do it in the lab and then you just scale up to commercial. And I like this idea of a lab pilot and then a field pilot and then maybe a portion of the service territory and even then you're saying you're selecting certain circuits where you think will have the most impact and then put the controls there so that you're getting the benefit without taking too much risk.
Right, because everyone's going to be different. Everyone's
Correct.
going to have different equipment and different results.
Yes. So what I will do now is open it up for Q&A, and I'm sure that there will be people who are going to be asking questions online, and there are going to be people here in the room. So for the purpose of the audience online, if someone asks a question in the room, then Art will repeat it just to acknowledge that he's heard the question correctly, and also the audio will be fed to our audience. And so that will be really good. So we will start here. There are, okay, so the first question is from Ray Hayes. He says, how do you deal with the voltage drop from the primary to the meter through the D-trans, which varies with load on the D-trans?
These will be things we find out as we test in the lab. We'll find out what happens with varying voltage, and part of that is going to be what's available in the lab, and then part of that's going to be then looking at our territory and seeing, okay, what if that were in the field? Because part of what we'll do in the lab is look at the results and then take that and see, okay, our territory looks like this, and we have these type of phenomena with equipment and primary versus secondary, and each system's going to do this differently, and so we'll have that'll be something that we'll figure out as we go during the testing. So I don't have a solution for that at this point.
The follow-on question from Ray Hayes asks what the main purpose of the VoltVAR optimization is. Is it efficiency or is it to clip the peak during certain times?
It's overall efficiency less than, as I understand it, less than peak.
Okay.
And will ultimately, voltage management will integrate with things like demand response, but earlier on will be efficiency first and then peak reduction as we go.
And then the next question, let's take this question and then we'll come to you, Craig. The next question is, Art, how are you going to simulate distributed generation?
So we've built the capability to simulate distributed generation in the lab, so we can feed back power as if we've got distributed generation through our meter environment at first, and we'll build to that because all of this is in sequence. You know, getting systems up and running, getting inflows, getting outflows, getting results, and then we're going to start at a more basic level, and then we'll add things like DG as we go. So we'll build on getting things to work and getting the end-to-end process to run and starting our evaluation, and then we'll add things as we go.
Question from Craig.
Yes, great presentation. Thank you, Art.
Thank you.
There was a slide that showed the user basically interfacing with AMI and suggesting that the voltage regulation was going to go on through that interface. And then I think it was the very next slide showed your parallel paths, one going through the simulation route, one going through the real. My question is, I think that second slide answered the question, which is, it's not the meter that's controlling the voltage. The meter is simply a communication conduit out to, I think it was to the tap changers and the capacitor banks. Is that where the ultimate voltage is going on in your?
Right. It's the difference between the lab and the field.
You want to repeat the question?
So the question is, from Craig, is is the meter controlling voltage, or just a device, a sensor device where we read the voltage? And is that?
And it's really more of a communication channel, right?
Right. And is the meter more of a communication channel? And it's basically, it's clearly not setting voltage. And the answer is absolutely. We read voltage values from the meter, and so we can use the meter, the 5+ million meters, as a full sensor network to identify what our voltage is. But the lines set the voltage, so the meters won't. Now, in the test environment, it's different because we're simulating this and we're testing it. So we've built the capability to change the voltage ourselves on the meters, so that we can manipulate that down to each meter itself. In the field, that doesn't happen. This is only in the lab where we'll change this specifically ourselves.
And a quick follow-on to the question, which is, you talked about PG. It sounds like you're not modeling that yet. And so this I probably know the answer to this question, but have you been looking into utilizing the advanced inverter functionality for VAR, for reactive power provisioning? Is that something on your roadmap that you're planning to model along with the distributed generation? Because the inverters have lots of VAR capacity.
So the question is, are we looking at using advanced inverters for VAR management as part of our roadmap and as part of our model?
Or as part of this overall project, VoltVAR Optimization?
We will at this point. We are looking at setting up the environment and we're building it. That will come as we go. So we are looking at that, and our model will become more complex as time goes on. Right now, we're building to it. So absolutely, yeah, that's a big consideration, and that will become part of the project as time goes on. We're not to that stage yet.
We'll take a question from the back, and then Dave.
Andrew Dillon from a company called Varntech here in San Jose. Comment and question. I've been part of over 12 planning for VVO projects. This is by far the most thorough test bed, including multi-vendor analysis and actually physically testing. So I commend you on that. I have one difficult question, which is that of all the solutions that are up in the field, they tend to look at a VVO on maybe tens of minutes or 15-minute, 5-minute cycles, when more and more of like the DG consumer pricing type voltage volatility is starting to move within a minute, even sometimes second by second. So are there tools today to evaluate VVO solutions as to whether they can respond and do VVO in a world that's PG&E is the largest PV installation utility in the country, where you've got things happening on a second-by-second basis that's random, like cloud cover and pricing signals, completely random, and the VVO system would have to adapt and do VVO in that environment.
So the question is, are we looking at solutions that can manage voltage at the minute or sub-minute level, because that's what's coming up, or becoming relative with distributed generation, and PG&E is has the largest distributed generation user base. We're not seeing, it's really part of what's dependent on this is what's available in the market, and part of that is constrained by how often can we communicate? Can we communicate at the sub-minute level? And then the effect of that is it valid to manage a circuit voltage at the sub-second level? So part of those, we're not looking at sub-second management at this point, just because we're not seeing the solutions that are there that can do that at the circuit level. But that's absolutely valid, and we're looking at lesser intervals, more like 15-minute intervals, and it's a very valid question. It's something to consider, but we're kind of constrained about what's available and what we can use today in the industry right now.
We have a question from Dave. Dev.
Hi, so I'm Devendra from GridMaven, and I have a question that this VoltVAR optimization means one good point which Efran said in the beginning is that even if you have the current controls, they are not being monitored. That's why you cannot do the effective control because there is no closed loop. And your test lab is doing great job of simulating models and voltages via the meters and all those kind of things. But all of this is going to depend on the underlying infrastructure of communications. Even for your smart meters, there is a communication network, and that's what you're doing. So one thing is reading the voltages from the meters, using the AMI network, and then deploying that to based on the analysis what your viewer application does or what your SCADA does, and deploying it to your tap changers and other control devices. So one missing piece which I see is the simulation of the communication network, how it is going to affect the communication network itself. Because when we talk about smart meters and you talk about 99.6% meter read successful and all this, it is because you are doing maybe 6 times a day the meter reads from your data concentrators. When you talk about VoltVAR optimization, where you have to read more frequently the meter voltage ping and those kind of things, when you have to do that, you will have to simulate the communication network. What's the impact of those voltage pings on the communication network in order for you to effectively read the voltages, as well as what's the latency available for you to deploy your control signals to your devices as well, your voltage regulators and tap changers and your cap back control. So have you considered simulating the communication as well as including communications infrastructure monitoring in order for you to have better confidence on your models as well as your test results? Because it all hinges on how much of communication capabilities you have, like whether your communication network is constant, in what situation is going to happen. For in a simulated environment for 50, 100, 10,000 meters, because simulation is most of the time is done to generate the best case results. So how it is going to affect your communication network,
right.
And that's what.
So basically, the question is how are we accounting for simulating hard to reach areas and different sensor networks, because we'll be reading meters and we can't reach, may not be able to reach all of them, or we can affect changes with the field equipment, and that's a different network. And how do we simulate when communications aren't optimal?
And as well as what's going to be the impact of doing voltage pings on your communication, smart meter communication?
Sure. And what's,
is it going to step on your meter reads at that time, because your billing system or MDM system is not going to allow you to do that if you are going to do and affect the communication network for your meter.
So how do we increase traffic on the AMI network without affecting meter to cache? That's a huge concern, and both of those are things we're looking at now. Like what we're doing with our smart meter operations is we're doing network analysis for each of our access points with our meters. So we're looking at when can we communicate, how often can we communicate, and then studying what's the effect on the network. Because we really can't go from 1 hour meter reads to 15-minute voltage reads on 5-minute meters, 5 million meters. It's just not something we could turn on. So we're doing that analysis over different areas through the access points with the meters. And then we're also looking at what are the hard to reach areas and characterizing what do those areas look like, remote river valleys. And what's the history on being able to communicate with these meters, and then looking, okay, for instance, what happens with an outage now, or what happens when something happens on that circuit? Where does the guy, what does he do to drive that circuit, and what's his procedure? So then we're strategizing, and then how do we reach those areas in an automated fashion? So that's sort of a separate network analysis effort, and that's very valid. There's several sensor networks, and we have hard-to-reach areas, so that won't happen in the lab. You're right. Now, we can do, and we do, negative test scenarios. We have a whole network test environment where we load the network, or we attenuate signals, or we do create negative situations to find out, how does this fail? What happens when I can't talk to this thing? And then what does the solution do when it loses this, or it only has 50% connectivity? So we're simulating some of those scenarios negatively in the lab, and then we're doing analysis over our territory.
Okay, let's keep moving because there are several questions that are online, and I'd like to get to them. There are many people are on the East Coast, and it's getting late there. So the next question is, what software is used for the model? Is it like a Synergy model?
We have a SIME system that we use for capacity, and then I know our DMS system uses a model. So what system is used for the model? We have it's either DMS or we use SIME.
Okay. Next question from Anderson Hoke says, okay, it's about the audio. Michael Shea says, what is the model for simulating the varying levels of penetration of rooftop solar PV in a neighborhood served by potentially 1+ circuits?
So I don't actually have the answer to that question. I know that we have a group that works with PV penetration and works with our model, but that's not actually the area I work in, so I can't answer that question because I don't know the answer.
Mike Shea, you see Art's email address. Please write to him. When he responds, I'll share it with the audience. Next question. Francis Cleveland asks, how are you going to incorporate the VoltVAR capabilities of distributed energy resources that are probably going to be required by the CPUC?
So part of that is, part of the answer to the question of how we'll incorporate the VoltVAR capabilities of distributed energy resources will be what we look at with each solution. What's the capability of each VoltVAR solution that we have, and then as we get those requirements, and part of those we're building those now as far as we looking at requirements as to how we look at these solutions. Part of it will depend. I think each solution will handle this differently because the solutions are so different. So I don't know exactly. I can't tell you exactly how we're going to do it, but that's something we're considering, and it'll vary by vendor product, and it also vary by the specificity of the requirements.
Right. And this is one area where the interoperability of DNP3 and IEC 61850-7-420 will also be needed, because if you see in the working groups, the object models that are being developed for DER are under the IEC 61850-7-420, whereas 85% of North American utilities use DNP3 for SCADA. So there is, I believe, a working group that's trying to map DNP3 with 61850 in order to transmit information back and forth between these two protocols. But I see a slow migration process that will need to occur in order to benefit from VoltVAR Optimization. Because if DER is not considered in the simulation, then you're really missing out a big piece of the picture. Because while storage can have a beneficial effect on VoltVAR, because you can use it for regulation, the renewable energy, wind and solar, actually could have a negative effect because it would raise the voltage or lower the voltage depending on whether it's available or not. And having seen some of the graphs of how it's available, it's like all over the place. And no 2 days are the same, so you can't even really plan.
Right. We absolutely have to include those scenarios.
Yes. So that's why the reason why Frances is asking is she's very actively involved in creating the object models for distributed energy resources within SGIP 2.0.
Okay.
We're working with Francis as well on these mappings and protocols as well.
Yes.
So are you doing any testing with these advanced inverters in your lab here now?
Not at this point.
Do you have a plan to do that sometime soon, or?
We have a plan to do it. We need to build the basic infrastructure first so that we can add more advanced functions to it. We've done a lot of inverter testing, and we have an inverter test lab as part of that facility. But as we get more advanced products, we'll need to include them. So we were sort of starting with the basic building blocks, and then we'll add to that.
Question here in the room.
You mentioned that you've talked to some utilities about their experiences. Have you consulted at all with any of the utilities in Italy or Germany where they have required the DERs to have some VoltVAR capabilities, and and how do they actually use or not use those capabilities today?
Not to my knowledge, Italy and Germany.
Okay.
I know we've been domestic, but I can check with my business analysts. They may have. But I'm more aware of the domestic companies we talk to.
The German approach is very minimal. Only if the voltage exceeds the desired amount by plus or minus 10%, which is very, very rare, will the inverters actually respond. So 99.9% of the time, voltage is not outside of 10%, and so they effectively never do that. So the Germany does not actually have a true solution that would work at all. In fact, there's a big debate whether the smart inverter is the right way to go. Many vendors, many issues, a consumer-owned asset versus a dedicated asset like a better cap bank or a better regulator that's cycle by cycle fast. There's several companies, including mine, that actually has a product like that. And we've been in touch with your group on that.
I know, I thought it was before Andrew.
Yeah.
So,
Art,
We
you
see a lot
want
of reporting by exception
would you,
software in this space.
Art, would you like to just summarize this discussion that occurred here in the room for the audience? We have almost 100 people on the line right now.
Okay. So the question, are we talking to German and Italian utilities about how they manage
distributed
energy resources and how they account for, well, actually, why don't you say it again? I may not be able to effectively paraphrase this.
yeah, how are some of the European utilities actually utilizing the VoltVAR capability of their DERs? The VAR generating capability.
How are the European utilities utilizing the VoltVAR capability of their distributed energy resources? And I know my business team has been talking with other utilities. I'm not aware if they've been talking to the German or Italian folks, but they may have.
It's interesting that as a result of the end of the Cold War, we just went from DDR to DER. Anyway, so.
I'd like to respond to this question about what's happening in Germany and Italy.
Yeah.
Tom Tanzi from Suspect Alliance. And the Italians, of course, are doing some experiments using some version of IEC 61850, and relatively early days there. As the gentleman in the back mentioned, the German solution is far more simplistic and primarily deals with curtailment. And finally, what I think that the Europeans are now learning is their first attempts in this area probably are not sufficient for addressing the challenges of bringing grid stability, and are in fact looking at all of the same methods that we are here in the United States. So it's somewhat ironic, since we're coming from so far and behind, that actually we're sort of getting out in front of this problem now in the U.S.
Yeah, but one point that the gentleman made from Varentech about the difference between the European tolerances, if you may, and the American tolerances raises the threshold above which VoltVAR optimization is really necessary over there. Here we have much tighter controls on the voltage, especially in the industrial sector. I don't know so much on the residential and commercial, but in the industrial sector we've seen much larger acceptable bands in the voltage variation, which allows for deeper penetration of renewable energy without requiring VoltVAR optimization. So the point was made. And Craig?
I just want to add to what's happening in Germany is that every renewable energy project that is greater than 3 kilowatts has to have the VAR capability set, and it's either set to provision reactive power. The power factor setting has to go down to a 0.9 or a negative 0.9, and it has to be able to respond in one of three ways: either a fixed setting, automated response, or a tonal signal from the utility. So some kind of communication from the utility. So it really, you had a table at the beginning that said, was it automated, was it kind of at the SCADA, or was it, somebody, I think there were three options.
Localized, centralized, or DMS-based, yeah.
So the Germans are way ahead of us in terms, the Germans are way ahead of us. I don't know what they're doing in Italy, but the Germans are way ahead of us in terms of bringing in the advanced inverter functionality into play.
Yes, so for the purpose of the audience, Craig Lewis of the Clean Coalition mentioned about certain conditions in which distributed energy resources are deployed in Germany. That includes the VoltVAR aspect built into the condition of deploying it. I think above 3 kilowatt, you said?
Anything over 3 kilowatts. So anything over a small residential system has to play.
So, so the requirement for VoltVAR is built into any additional capacity that's being brought on the grid using distributed energy resources. Okay, we have to move on because there are so many questions here. And I know people are waiting patiently to hear their answers. If you were, so Karthik wants to know about brownies at PG&E SmartGrid Lab. He says, is it possible to visit SmartGrid Lab with prior permission? Which is another way of asking, are you going to offer brownies to him when you get there?
Rarely do we offer brownies, unlike these, but we do arrange tours of the lab.
Okay, great.
Brownies, then we can get a tour.
Yes. Okay, Karthik, bring the brownies so you will get ahead in line. Okay. Paul Carroll says, if you were a utility without the scale of PG&E and could not build out an entire test lab yard, how would you approach implementing an intelligent VVO program? And I'm glad he's asking this question because so much of the infrastructure in the United States is small co-ops or munis that may not have the deep pockets and the wherewithal to do this. So is there a shortcut?
Well, I think if you're how would I approach this if I did not have the scale and the lab at PG&E? Ecosystem would be paramount, because if you're small and you only have a certain amount of equipment, if it doesn't work with what you got, it doesn't work at all. So that would limit the choices, just because you really have to make anything you put in work with what you've got. And then I ask the bigger folks, ask the larger utilities, because they may have deployed something on more circuits than you have. So they may have exceeded your territory size in one of their deployments. And utilities freely talk to each other. You can call people and get information. And so I would look at the solutions, ask other utilities, and then figure out what your ecosystem looks like, because you're going to be limited. And then make your best call.
Michael Shea asks, in the hardware in the loop system testing process, has the response time of the various software models been real time, like hardware, or else?
We haven't seen it yet because we're still building it. So we'll be able to do that comparison, and we'll be able to manipulate that and figure out how fast things can respond, and what we want to see to be able to compare that to the field. But we're still building the pieces at this point. We don't have anything running end to end.
Sayansam Chanda asks, how often are the models updated?
Actually, in this context, different vendors have different ideas. Sometimes it's daily, sometimes it's more often than that. From a capacity planning, it's much less often than that, but if you're doing dynamic VoltVAR, it's going to be more often. So in this situation, this is going to vary, and it's going to be vendor dependent. And then we're going to actually have to understand, is whatever we're seeing enough, or is it too much?
The next question that Sayansam asks is about granularity in the model. To what level of detail are the models updated? Say you have a campus with an internal distribution system at a different distribution system voltage. Does the model include all the buildings of the campus, or just consider the campus as a single load?
I think it depends on the campus.
Okay.
The size, because if it's a couple buildings, probably a single load, but if it's something the size of Berkeley or something like that, that's almost like a small city. So yes. I imagine the model takes into account all the different pieces. So I think that's a very site-specific thing.
Yes, and Corey Hall has to be treated completely separate from everything.
Right.
Next question is, are the models in CYME and DMS always in sync? If not, what kind of things go wrong?
So if the model, what happens if the model in SIME is out of sync with DMS? They kind of have, as I understand it, their purposes are slightly different, and what can go wrong is a misunderstanding about the system or about what the system can do or the state the system is. And so part of the objective of this effort is to have more visibility. Right. I mean, we can have, as we get voltage from meters, we'll have more visibility. Are things wrong, and how do the circuits look? So I really don't know how often they're out of sync, but I know adding this type of management capability and visibility will help correct these kinds of errors.
This is a good example of where the semantic model becomes really critical, that there is a universal language by which these various systems understand what attribute is being represented there, and not to make any assumptions. It has to be very precise. And the other thing is that in order to have situational awareness, the logs of what's going on needs to be understood. Almost like in cybersecurity where we have the SIEM model, like we have a set of standard alarms that every system understands. So similarly, in order to reduce the times when these two are out of sync, requires a very tight vocabulary. And this is where that -7-420 working group is going to come in really handy, because what's happening is we're going to more and more granular attributes. And the more granular attributes you go to and represent them in an object model, the less is the variance in interpretation of what's going on. The higher level, you know, so like when you're at the profile level, there's a lot of variability. But it was good to support the system at the time. But now that we're putting more and more DER, it's important to have that granular control and to be able to represent it. That's key, because in the FCAPS model, fault is only one of the 5 things, right? There's configuration, there's accounting, there's performance, there's security. So all of them have attributes that the industry needs to embrace. And then people can write software. The code is useless if you don't have a common understanding of what you're talking about. Just writing code doesn't solve anything. Okay. So the next question is, Leo Jones says, do you have feeders that don't support LTC? That's the line tap changer, I guess. And voltage regulators, do you plan to investigate cap-only solutions?
We have different configurations in the field, and when we've looked at different circuits to get data from and use for modeling or analysis, we found certain circuits don't have the equipment we need, and certain circuits like only one recloser, or so different. The circuits look different, so we've had to, you know, pick different ones and look around for ones that have everything we need. And from a solution perspective, I can't talk about what the ones we're looking at are, but I can say they are different in the way they address equipment. And so solutions that are more limited, like a cap-only solution, is going to be less appealing to a utility like PG&E, because we need solutions that are more flexible and can do and offer us more opportunity versus less. So in the RFI, I bet we have a cap-only solution, and when we look at it as how will this roll out in our territory, it probably won't fare so well.
So for those of you who are not heavy-duty into electrical systems, the notion here is that if you introduce a capacitor bank or remove it, it changes the impedance of the circuit. And because it changes the impedance, the actual voltage on the line can vary depending on whether you've put the capacitor bank on the line or you've taken it off. So that's one way of adjusting voltage. But it's a bit wasteful if you remove the cap bank to increase the voltage or decrease the voltage. That's actually wasteful. If you use the line tap thing, that what you're doing is on the transformer, you're varying the location where you're making contact on the secondary coil. So that's a very precise control of doing voltage. So the capacitor bank helps you in trying to get as close to unity power factor. But to remove the capacitor bank just to lower the voltage, because now you're throwing the voltage vector off, is not the most efficient way. But if you don't have the line tap changer, then you have to rely on the capacitor bank to do it.
Now, if our strategy was to pick several solutions and use different solutions for different circuits and different environments, that probably would be much more valid. But that's really not our approach.
So one thing you're going to see in the utility industry across the board is, as VVO applications are being deployed, follow the RFPs that come out from these utilities to the vendors who will make capacitor banks, who will make those controllers on the transformers. You'll see those requirements getting more and more stringent and having more smarts on them, so that there's a slow process of moving from this very passive, Ohm's law, Kirchhoff's law way of doing grid to the more intelligent way where there's an information system that's feeding back for active control. And that's why if you saw his verbs at the beginning, the last one was control, right? You have that sense and communicate and then analyze and then control. So how are you going to do that if you don't have smarts on your devices? So we're going to slowly see these old systems being gutted out, and the new systems that come in not only will follow electrical engineering principles, but they'll have an IT aspect to them too. All right, moving along. Next question is from Bugra Yannick. What are the bare minimum communication protocol requirements for an acceptable product in new generation smart grid networks in terms of must-have, nice-to-have, and optional categories? Someone is about to launch a communications company here.
So the bare minimum communication protocol requirements for an acceptable product in a new generation smart grid network. Communication varies by product, and it varies by vendor. So some people are going to say, offer me a 2G solution. Some people are going to offer me an LTE solution, and some people are going to offer me a 3G solution. Or some people are going to say use AMI, and some people are going to say plug in whatever you feel like. And so the onus is really on the utility to say, okay, I need to measure my AMI network and see what my bandwidth is and see how this is going to work and how is this going to fail. If it's cellular, I need to look at my territory and do a comparison of where's my 2G coverage? Okay, what if that goes away? What does 3G look like to replace it? And then if we're going to LTE, what does LTE look like? And if that's reducing coverage, what's my alternative? So I don't have a minimum protocol requirement that anyone's going to give me. What I've got to do is look at how does this work where I have assets? And where do I not have things working now or not have things working as good as I think they should work? And then somebody offers me an alternative, then I have to say, and so how's that going to work there? Is that going to improve my situation or make it worse? And so everything really has to be, and then we may have a solution that doesn't have a good communication infrastructure. We might need to say, we're going to put this infrastructure on that solution because that will give me the reliability that I need. But a protocol standard's not going to help us in a territory like PG&E. What we have to do is look at the territory, look at the landscape, look at the coverage, and then understand what's the best technology.
Yeah. If you're talking about general direction, Bugra, I would say that, make sure that there is IP in the middle of the stack, because that's the universal addressing scheme that our planet seems to be headed towards. Now, that is a connectionless based protocol, so make sure that you have higher layer controls in your stack in order to have priority on traffic, because not all traffic, unlike the Constitution of the United States, not all traffic was made equal. There are some administrative controls where you need to have guaranteed throughput in order to get there. So then that would be the equivalent of having the old serial interfaces that were dedicated for a purpose. You can today create channels in an IP network that will give you that guarantee. And then I would say that don't be so obsessed on bandwidth alone. Bandwidth is just one dimension in a communication network. It's the processing capability of the intermediary devices that can sometimes add more latency than the actual transport from point A to point B. And it's additive. And every device along the way will add it. Try doing that sometime when you do a ping, and you find out that the transit time, if you do a one-way versus round trip, you find that the loop back from that end device may actually take longer than the trip going and coming back. So there are many dimensions to a communication network. Bandwidth is just one. All right, next.
Like our mobile devices in the field where we're deploying devices to field representatives, they actually use VPN connections that go cell, Wi-Fi, and wired, seamlessly. So something like that could be a possibility.
Next question is from Leo Jones. How are you going to plan for voltage drops on feeders that are long and are 13 kilovolts?
First, we'll have to see how the solutions work, and then plan on a circuit, basically on a circuit and condition basis. So I don't know what that answer will look like at this point. We have to understand what the capacity is and what the alternatives are to give us an idea of how we'll manage the more onerous circuits.
So we're definitely moving in the direction of more sensors further out onto the extremity. The meter is a very good endpoint value, but that doesn't mean that you don't need sensors along the way, especially for rapid fault isolation.
Part of the reason we're looking at our other two pilots are fault detection and line sensors.
Yep. As the CVR, which is conservation voltage reduction, could change the dynamics of multiple circuits in a cascaded fashion, what kind of mechanism is there in the grid to help damping down the transients?
So part of that is going to be, part of that will get, well, the awareness will be from AMI, the voltage readings from the meters, but then that's going to be monitoring the grid devices. And that's going to come back from, so I understand, that's going to come back to our SCADA system.
Yeah. And part of the absorption for transients, in the old days, it used to be excess capacity. Today, that would be in the form of electric storage or in the form of capacitor banks. So then you can absorb the effect of the transient, essentially. And there is a concept of bias, so you have to also start thinking about the bias that is created. I'm talking voltage bias, not human bias. And that can actually throw you in the wrong part of the storage. So you have to keep correcting for that bias so that you stay kind of in the middle and not go to an extreme where the storage doesn't work for you anymore. So there are these subtle things that are involved in this business. Did you want to say something? Okay. So, by the way, Michael Shea is an instructor in the UC Berkeley Extension, and he teaches classes on SmartGrid. So that's why he's asking these SAT-type questions here. Chase Sun of PG&E has been very active in the Smart Inverter Working Program, where German experiences have been reviewed. The Europeans do use VoltVAR in MV systems.
So Chase at PG&E is the knowledgeable person here.
Oh,
Thank
okay.
you, Francis. Yeah.
Very good. So now let's go to the chat window because there were some more questions here in the chat. So Jeff St. John asked, how can VoltVAR optimization capability fit into PG&E's distributed renewable generation energy storage management goals? Is such a role envisioned, and if so, how does that fit into the lab pilot integrated solutions testing timeline? Jeff St. John from Green Tech Media.
So this is part of what distribution operations looks at and this distributed renewable strategy. So this is just one piece of it. I've just been talking today as kind of one small corner of the world. So this, and it affects, much of our territory, but this will be part of a strategy. So at this point, we're getting to what we could deploy with what solution, And once we find out what's viable and what's usable and which direction we want to go, then we'll align it with our overall strategy and we'll bring more advanced capability into the lab.
Next question from Anurag. What are the biggest challenges in VoltVAR implementation with CVR? How do you justify the reduced revenue with CVR?
So reduction at a basic level, PG&E's rates are decoupled. So selling more power does not make us more money. In fact, the rates do the reverse. Power is more expensive the more you use. So and we're regulated, so how much power we sell doesn't affect our revenue, it's the same. And if it were to be increased and we made more, we'd have to give that money back. So the biggest challenge in VoltVAR implementation with CVR is it's really compatibility and management.
Yeah. One of the challenges is that as we move to a higher percentage in distributed energy resources, you may end up in situations where CVR may take you down to a voltage where then the unavailability of the renewable energy could drop it even further. So we have to have very quick control to bring it back up again if that were to happen. When renewable energy is a small percentage of the energy mix, the perturbation is going to remain small. So this is something we need to think about as RPS targets of 33% are there.
Kind of a byproduct of this is going to be more visibility. Basically bringing more communication, more visibility, so we'll be able to understand what's happened on what circuit before there's a problem.
Craig.
I was just going to say, if your real power is going down off the distributed generation, then you have more of the inverter capacity available to provision VARs. So the reactive power is what really controls the voltage, and you can just use more of that inverter capacity for provisioning reactive power.
Right. So all of this means that you have to have a communication network in place and an information loop back where it's not just on best effort. Like the way a smart meter measurement goes up, it could take 5 minutes, it could take an hour. As long as it's built, it doesn't matter. But when it's in real-time operations, you have to make sure that that piece of data gets to where the decision needs to be made.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, you not only lose revenue, but
we have specific windows for our smart meter reads. They must come in on time.
Yes. So next question is from Francis Cleveland. How are you going to incorporate the VoltVAR capabilities of DR that are, we did that. So then now, okay. Do any of your vendor platforms now being tested include or envision the ability to include smart inverters as a tool along with LTC, cap banks, or other traditional systems for managing VoltVAR?
I can't say what the specific ones include right now because we're still in an RFI. So I mean they do, but some do. Let me just say some do and some don't.
Okay, and the next question is ditto the same question for any power electronics, VAR, or voltage regulation devices a la Varantech. Oh, great go, etc. Favorable mention here. Okay.
As a journalist, right?
Yes.
I'm not aware of the specifics in that regard, actually, just because we're so focused on getting these things to run and plan it. And it's part of our discovery process. So we'll get to more advanced functionality as we go, but at this point we're not there yet. And probably some people smarter than me are. But
Ray asks, with the variation in voltage at the meter due to load and DG variation, are you considering a distribution state estimator to stabilize the input to your models?
some of the solutions include those, and some of them don't. And that's kind of one of the answers to what if your model's bad. You know, it's your model is not the answer we want. You know, state estimators are very, very useful because, yeah, the model could be bad, the model could have errors, and we've got to figure out how do we deal with that.
Very good. So we just went over about 3 or 4 minutes into past 2 o'clock, and I'm glad that we were able to cover all the questions and get answers to the satisfaction of the people who gave them, both verbally as well as online.
Thanks for all the great questions, by the way.
Yeah. Thank you, Art, for coming out and presenting and sharing your experience at PG&E. Often in the outside world, people don't know what's going on when they go by that tennis ball-looking roof on Crow Canyon. So now they know that there is a little distribution yard there, and there's some labs there, and there's some simulation going on. But what I really enjoyed about your presentation is how you're making good use of actual hardware, electrical systems, information technology, and simulation software, and how you're bringing all of that together in what I would call a predictor-corrector method. It's like you come up with something, you test it out, you see how it works in simulation, in reality, and then you make your modifications. And I'm hoping that, or I'm expecting that you're looking for convergence, where you can run different types of use cases that simulate different portions of your service territory and be able to control things the way you want to control them for a business end. And that business end means, you know, more availability of electricity at a more affordable price, safely and reliably. So I really thank you for sharing this experience. We are going to have a webinar in March, and it's going to be on how to reduce the barriers for customer engagement with energy information. And I will have Jean Wong of People Power coming and talking. As you know, People Power has come out with an app called Presence, which has really turned heads in the media. And he's going to share a little bit about what he has been able to do and how that will make the whole energy management be available in the hands of consumers and make something boring and geeky look appealing. So we need more of this kind of input in our industry. We tend to love spreadsheets and mathematical equations, and I'm all for that. But for some reason, it doesn't have the same mass appeal that social networking has or other things in our society. So Gene and his team are going to be talking, and I believe it's going to be on March 27th, which is Thursday, and it will be at 12:30 Pacific, and I will be sending out details about that. Thank you all for coming today here in Pleasanton, and for the 100+ people who are online today. We were very close to setting the all-time record. The all-time record was when Bill Bryan, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of DOE, spoke. He broke all records. There were 195 people. We got to 182 today. So Art, you are very close to the all-time record. And thanks again to Gary Sorkin, who generously gives us the place, generously provides us the lunch, and of course his award-winning company. So thank you all, and have a wonderful afternoon. I'm going to now stop the recording.